Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So this video is going to deal with the fraught subject of political correctness and trigger warnings and the culture wars more generally. And right at the outset, I just want to sort of tell you what I think, and then I'll try to provide a bit of analysis. So I think that trigger warnings are very important. I use them in my courses when I'm talking about really difficult topics like death and suffering, which I do quite often because I'm a bit morbid. So I'm not here to criticize the idea of trigger warnings. I think they're mostly a good thing. I also think, perhaps a bit more controversially, that political correctness as a wider scope term for a new kind of normative obligation that we face in society is important. I think that this notion captures or represents a way of us becoming collectively more self-aware about the subtleties of our social milieu and the tacit power dynamics that structure personal and professional relationships. And I think that it's important that we become aware of the substructure of normativity that we live in and to become more explicit about what we owe each other. Therefore, on the whole, I tend to think that the rhetoric from right-leaning pundits around snowflakes is a bit fraught and problematic. And so therefore needs to be unpacked in a much more careful way. And so that's what I'm going to try to do, at least in a preliminary way, in this short video. So to get started, I want to just sort of shift the context a bit and give you an example, somewhat playful example. So one of my favorite bands, in fact, my very favorite band in the world is Tool. Maybe you've heard of this band. I love their concerts. I go as often as I can, though they're quite famous now, and so their concerts are a bit expensive for me, but I get out there when I can. And I find Tool to be one of the most evolved and sophisticated musical acts in the history of popular music. But whenever I go to their concert, there's always a bunch of really drunk, obnoxious people just kind of making a mess and being silly. Does that mean that Tool is a bad band? No. It means they have bad fans, and I'm using the word bad here in a very loose and broad sense. The same is true of good ideas, okay? So there are lots of bad agents with good ideas, and no good idea is without supporters who do not understand it. That's how things get done in the world. If you think about social and political movements of any kind, all democratic movements, all social movements, whether they, socially, politically, these sorts of movements are based on ideas that are then deeply absorbed by enough people that democratic consensus is reached and change occurs. But that means that all changes in our social and political fabric occur at the behest of a tyranny of the majority. And that's just why Aristotle claimed that democracy is one of three forms of bad governments, because in a democracy, decisions are taken by the majority. And according to him, the majority is ignorant. So right at the outset, I think that it's possible, indeed perhaps inevitable, that any good idea that finds strong footing in our social consciousness will have bad agents enacting that idea in unskillful ways. And that doesn't mean the idea is bad. And I'll return to that point at the end. Now, for a long time, I thought that worries about trigger warnings, political correctness, freedom of speech were all really overblown, and that it was an excuse for right-leaning pundits to just dunk on the left. But once I became a professor and a member of a university and a parent and a member of a wider community of parents at a school, I realized that there are things to worry about, and rather than walk you through, concrete examples, I just want to point out one general phenomena that I think is really important to keep in mind when trying to understand why people get so stressed out about this stuff on the right side of on the right. So people use the word triggered in all kinds of problematic ways as code for being slightly uncomfortable with something someone has said. And I just don't think that's how we should be using the word, right? If you are triggered, it means that you are reliving a traumatic event on the basis of some sensory cue that reminded you of the traumatic event you're currently reliving, okay? And I've been in a number of situations where people will say things like, I'm feeling a little triggered about this because, and if you're feeling a little triggered, you're not triggered, right? Are you having a full-blown panic attack? Are you vividly reliving a traumatic experience in real time? Then you're triggered. Okay. So I think one of the problems that we have here is people starting to co-opt this language in order to push back against situations where they feel slightly uncomfortable, maybe called out, maybe they are, feeling unhappy or reliving a repressed emotion. But we need to be careful about what this language is used for. And I think that one way to kind of gatekeep in a wholesome way that will make this concept work for us in a skillful way is to reserve it for extreme cases, right? Cases where a person is not okay. And when that person is suffering because something in their environment has set off a memory association that's causing them to relive a traumatic experience, that we should take care of this person. And that's why warnings around potential content, especially content pertaining to violence, can be really helpful to people who have had experiences of various forms of violence in their past and don't want to relive those things while trying to get a degree. So I do think that our society is struggling to become more compassionate and self-aware about the ways in which trauma affects the lives of people in it. And I think that's a really good thing. And I think the establishment of new social norms and decorum around these kinds of challenges is also a good thing. But when that kind of compassion is utilized as a way of shutting down conversation because you don't like the ideas or perspective being expressed, that's just a form of bad faith, right? That's not a rigorous attitude. It's hard to tell the difference. That's one of the challenges. But the balance I see us needing strikes me as looking like something of the following. So we need trigger warnings. We need norms of political correctness to help us continue to become more sensitive to subtle and pervasive forms of oppression and stress that impact people's lives. It is a way of taking collective responsibility for the world we've built for ourselves and to help us recognize that this world doesn't bestow benefits on its populations in a justly distributive way. At the same time, we must exercise caution and vigilance in avoiding becoming so reactionary that we entrain ourselves into a social norm of psychological brittleness and reactionary outrage. The cultivation of fine-grained discernment of moral valence and the establishing of an accompanying resilience and commitment to justice is both necessary and laudatory. But generating reactive attitudes to subtle phenomena is a recipe for collective disaster. Finding the balance between increased awareness on the one hand of these pervasive forms of oppression and misery that plague our world while also on the other hand cultivating strength that keeps us subtle and responsive rather than reactionary and brittle is the key. Now, what does that look like? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. This particular struggle is easier for me because I'm a straight white dude with quite a lot of power and privilege relative to a lot of other people in this world. So I haven't really had too much trouble on this issue because I'm not oppressed. So I'm here to just, suggest one way of addressing the problem by understanding the problem in a certain way. But what the concrete solution looks like is, it's not really for me to decide, right? On that front, I think of myself as a listener, as someone who is eager to learn. But one thought I'll conclude with is that I do believe that when pundits decry snowflakes and dismiss trigger warnings and political correctness as symptoms of a social leftism that's kind of lost and obsessed with finger pointing, I think this is very lopsided, and they're missing a subtle point. That is, first, with every good idea, there will be people putting those ideas to bad use. That's just a fact of human nature. And that doesn't mean that the ideas are bad, and it certainly doesn't mean that the ideas aren't put to good use often. What we have to remember is that we don't often hear about the good uses because these ideas are designed to preempt difficult situations. So when they work well, no one has a panic attack in class. And therefore, there's nothing to report. So we hear about the negative cases because those are cases where good ideas are being used poorly, and that rightly causes us concern. But these ideas have done a lot of work to help people cope with difficult situations. And I do think that a heightened sense of social responsibility is a way of elevating our collective conduct. But that doesn't mean we don't have a long way to go. We do have a long way to go, and that's okay.